when the billionaire philanthropist Bill Gates presumed he could outmaneuver Ibrahim Traoré with a disingenuous malaria initiative, he failed to account for the young African leader's sharp intellect and unwavering courage. What was designed to be a subtle act of manipulation spectacularly imploded as Traoré laid bare the truth for all to witness. Gates's expression conveyed everything: shock, dismay, and deep embarrassment. This unforgettable confrontation is now igniting global dialogues on fairness, honor, and Africa's determined resistance to exploitation. The Grand Hall in Ouagadougou was thick with a quiet apprehension. Representatives from foreign non-governmental organizations and local administrators assembled, their attention shifting between their papers, computer screens, and the young man presiding at the far end of the table, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, transitional president of Burkina Faso. On the surface, the assembly was dedicated to a noble endeavor, the fight against malaria. However, beneath the polished decorum and glowing slideshows, a darker motive was concealed. Bill Gates's envoys detailed a plan involving genetically modified mosquitoes, hailing it as a miraculous solution. They spoke of millions of dollars in promised funds, advanced foreign technology, and the swift eradication of the disease. To the outside world, it appeared to be a gesture of salvation. But to Traoré, the narrative felt dissonant. The fine print of the agreement was far more revealing than the grand promises. The proposed partnership effectively required surrendering control over Burkina Faso's territory, its scientific laboratories, and the health of its citizens to external entities. Then came the hushed insinuation from behind the scenes, delicate hint of personal rewards, strategic investments, and political backing should Traoré approve the project. What had been presented as a straightforward negotiation started to feel like an elaborate snare. The young leader's gaze hardened. The charitable facade was beginning to fray, and the underlying reality was on the verge of being exposed. For several hours, the presentations continued. They displayed charts illustrating malaria infection rates, maps pinpointing affected villages, and an overwhelming array of statistics. The foreign delegates painted a grim picture of urgency, insisting that immediate action was necessary to prevent thousands more from perishing. Yet Traoré's intuition screamed that something was profoundly amiss. Why the intense pressure to finalize the agreement so quickly? Why were clauses granting foreign oversight of Burkina Faso's health data, its soil, and even its native mosquito populations embedded in the contracts? As he leafed through the pages, a single line arrested his attention. All experimental rights retained by the funding institution. A knot formed in his chest. This was not merely about malaria. It was about dominion. Later that evening, Traoré conferred with his most trusted advisors. Moussa, his loyal guard, offered his thoughts in a low voice. Excellency, their proposal is presented as a gift, but a gift with strings attached is a chain. Once we are bound by it, we will find it impossible to break free. Traoré leaned back, his mind filled with images of his people, the farmers, the children, the mothers, who had borne the burden of centuries of foreign exploitation. Could he permit another deception cloaked in the guise of philanthropy? The answer was a resolute no. A fire ignited within him. He would not capitulate. He resolved that the truth must be brought into the light, and it would be done in a public forum. The following morning, the assembly reconvened. Cameras were recording, journalists were diligently taking notes, and the hall was filled with an air of anticipation. Bill Gates had chosen to be present in person this time, exuding an aura of confidence, serenity, and the certainty of a foregone conclusion. His delegation presented the final proposal, $500 million in funding, coupled with a pledge to transform Burkina Faso into a showcase for the African continent. A smattering of applause broke out in certain sections of the room, but Traoré sat motionless, his hands interlocked. At last, he rose to his feet. His voice was composed, yet held an edge sharp enough to cut through the veneer of eloquent words. We have not gathered here to sell our homeland. We are not here to abdicate our sovereignty. Burkina Faso is not a laboratory for experimentation. Our people are not test subjects. A sudden hush fell over the room. Gates blinked, his smile freezing on his face. The cameras immediately focused on him, capturing his shock, his unease, and the subtle quaver of humiliation. Traoré held the contract aloft for everyone to see. You label this a campaign against malaria. I will call it by its true name, exploitation. Audible gasps rippled through the hall. The meticulously arranged deal had just shattered, and the world was about to scrutinize every resulting fissure. The chamber was still heavy with astonishment. Reporters paused mid-sentence, uncertain if they had heard correctly. Officials fidgeted, avoiding eye contact. Bill Gates leaned into his microphone, managing a strained smile. "Captain Traoré, there may have been a misunderstanding. Our purpose is to save lives, not to exploit." But Traoré's gaze was unyielding, his voice as sharp as steel. If this was truly about saving lives, why do these contracts grant foreign corporations authority over our land, our laboratories, and our private health data? Why are the financial rewards for outsiders detailed in gold while my people are burdened with all the risks and given no voice? A murmur swept through the attendees. Journalists strained forward, their cameras zooming in for a closer look. Gates's polished composure began to disintegrate, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. Musa, the guard, stood by the wall, sensing the shift. The atmosphere was charged. The power dynamic was reversing. For the first time, the billionaire appeared diminished, cornered by a truth he assumed no one would have the audacity to articulate, and Traoré had more to say. He lifted a sheaf of papers from the table, his tone resolute but measured. "This particular clause," he read aloud, "stipulates that all genetically modified samples shall remain the property of the funding institution. This other clause transfers exclusive research rights to foreign entities. I ask you, is this a crusade against malaria, or is it the theft of our sovereignty?" Gasps sounded throughout the hall as cameras flashed relentlessly. A few officials hid their faces in their hands. Gates shifted in his chair, his jaw clenched. His customary calm assurance had seemingly evaporated, replaced by the raw discomfort of being publicly unmasked before millions. Traoré let the documents fall back onto the table, the sound echoing in the silence. "Our citizens will not serve as your lab rats. Burkina Faso will not be purchased." The journalists could no longer restrain themselves. A barrage of questions flew from every direction, voices overlapping as every camera lens remained fixed on Gates's rigid, ashen face. Musa observed history being made. For decades, Africa's leaders had deferred in these kinds of settings. Today, one was standing his ground, and the entire globe was bearing witness. Bill Gates raised a hand, attempting to quell the rising chaos. "Let us be rational. These initiatives have international backing. You are risking the isolation of your nation." But his caution was lost in the force of Traoré's response. Burkina Faso would prefer to stand alone with its dignity than to kneel in shame. "If your genuine desire is to help, then approach us with respect, not with shackles masquerading as charity." The room erupted. Some applauded, while others shouted their assent. The press corps documented every fleeting emotion on Gates's face. The pursed lips, the darting eyes, the rare sight of a powerful man caught unprepared for defiance. The issue was no longer confined to contracts. It had become a raw contest of power who possessed it, and who refused to relinquish it. Outside the hall, crowds were already forming, eager for information. As the initial video clips began circulating online, a wave of notifications swept across the continent. The messages were clear. Traoré confronted Gates. Africa is not for sale. In that instant, the fraudulent deal had disintegrated. Yet the ensuing struggle, political, economic. Within hours, the confrontation became a global media firestorm. Video of Traoré brandishing the contract proliferated across the internet. Headlines proclaimed, "African leader challenges Gates on fake malaria deal," and Traoré defends sovereignty in fiery exchange. In Ouagadougou, citizens flooded the streets. Young men painted murals of lions on city walls, accompanied by the declaration, "Africa is not for sale." Mothers holding infants offered quiet prayers of thankfulness, remarking, "Finally, someone is speaking for us." Meanwhile, within the opulent offices of Washington, London, and Geneva, the atmosphere was grim. Advisors scrambled to contain the fallout, issuing carefully crafted statements that reiterated Gates's commitment to global health and dismissed Traoré's allegations as simple misunderstandings. But the video footage conveyed a different narrative. The image of Gates's tense, uncomfortable expression had become an international symbol of public humiliation. Traoré, however, did not indulge in celebration. He sat quietly with his advisors. That evening, listening intently, at length he spoke. "This is not about causing humiliation. It is about affirming dignity. We have a duty to show the world that integrity is not a commodity to be bought. Not now, not ever." The conflict had moved beyond the conference hall. It was now playing out on every screen. The next day, a private meeting was demanded. Gates. Representatives attempted to exert pressure on Burkinabe officials, issuing warnings of aid suspensions, travel restrictions, and diplomatic estrangement. But Traoré's response was resolute and unwavering. If assistance is offered with chains, it is not assistance but a form of bondage, and Burkina Faso will not be enslaved. The room fell into a profound silence. The foreign delegates shared uneasy looks. They were accustomed to dealing with leaders who acquiesced readily. This young captain was an entirely different matter. He spoke with the conviction of a man who feared nothing except the betrayal of his own people. Outside the presidential palace, ordinary citizens waited with bated breath. Rumors of sanctions and reprisals were circulating, but so too were songs of defiance. Women selling mangoes at the market sang softly, "It is better to be poor with honor than to be rich with shame." That night, Traoré walked through the city streets with only Moussa by his side. The people recognized him and surged forward. Some knelt, others wept, but all repeated the same sentiment. "Thank you for protecting our dignity," Moussa whispered. They would rather face hunger than be sold. At that moment, Traoré understood that the courage of his people was a force more powerful than any external threat. By the third day, the confrontation had become a central topic of global conversation. Young people across Africa on social media celebrated Traoré as a hero, posting messages like, "This is the Africa we have dreamed of." Hashtags such as #TRAORE, the lion, and #Africa, not for sale, trended globally. In Western capitals, however, a sense of panic was setting in. Pundits on television debated whether Burkina Faso had established a perilous new precedent, one that might encourage other nations to refuse similar agreements. Gates maintained an uncharacteristic silence. His public relations team worked tirelessly to restore his image. But the viral footage of his rigid expression during the meeting eclipsed every official press release. The world had already formed its own judgment based on what it had witnessed. A billionaire caught off guard by the courage of a young African leader in Ouagadougou. Schools conducted special assemblies. Teachers explained the events to students not as a political issue, but as a moment of history in the making. Young boys declared, "We will be lions too." Girls raised their hands, vowing, "We will protect our land." Moussa, standing guard at the palace gates, felt tears well in his eyes. This was no longer about a single agreement. It was about the very soul of Africa, and that was a sentiment everyone could feel. By the fourth day, the blowback had begun. International organizations issued statements condemning Burkina Faso's reckless decision. Threats of suspended aid started to circulate through diplomatic channels. On television, analysts warned that Traoré was steering his country toward isolation. Some even speculated that foreign investors might withdraw their capital entirely. Within the palace, advisors engaged in heated debate. Some advocated for a compromise to de-escalate the situation, but Traoré sat in quiet contemplation, hearing them out. Finally he spoke, his tone unyielding. "If our independence has a price tag, then it was never true independence to begin. Let them withdraw their aid, our dignity is not subject to negotiation." The room became silent as even his staunchest allies absorbed the gravity of his words. Concurrently, ordinary citizens started donating food, equipment, and their labor to local initiatives, resolved to demonstrate that Burkina Faso could be self-reliant. Women in the markets sang, "We are sufficient, we are strong," but as hope surged within the country, ominous clouds gathered on the horizon. Whispers of retribution intensified. Gates and his powerful allies were far from finished. The true tempest was still approaching. That evening, Traoré convened his ministers for an urgent session. Spread across the table were reports concerning the target malaria facility's laboratories filled with genetically modified mosquito specimens, all financed by the Gates Foundation. Traoré listened as his scientists detailed the potential ecological risks of introducing these altered organisms into Burkina Faso's environment. After a lengthy pause, he reached his verdict. "Shut them down," he commanded. "Destroy every last sample. Burkina Faso will not serve as a proving ground." Gasps filled the room. Several ministers hesitated, cautioning against the certain international outcry, but Traoré was adamant. "Our ancestors fought to preserve the freedom of this land. I will not permit it to be bound now by invisible chains of science." The directive became public knowledge within hours. Bulldozers were dispatched to the facilities. Armed guards secured the perimeters as the destruction of the mosquito enclosures was broadcast live. Outside, crowds celebrated, chanting, "Africa is not for sale." The global reaction was one of fury. Detractors decried the action as anti-science, while proponents lauded it as a historic defense of sovereignty. And somewhere, observing it all silently, Gates understood that he had completely lost control of the situation by the fifth day. Gates's discomfiture was no longer a private matter, but a worldwide spectacle. Clips of him sitting stiffly as Traoré deconstructed the deal continued to lead news reports. Memes inundated social media, featuring side-by-side images of a proud lion and a billionaire appearing to shrink in his seat. Leaders from neighboring countries began to express their solidarity. Some described Traoré's action as the catalyst for a new era in Africa. Universities hosted debates on national sovereignty. In churches and mosques, prayers were offered for Burkina Faso's continued courage. Inside the palace, Moussa observed his president from a distance. He could see the exhaustion etched in Traoré's eyes, yet he also saw a fire that would not be extinguished. That evening, Traoré delivered a direct address to his people on national television. His voice was calm, but his gaze was like steel. "This past week has revealed a fundamental truth to us," he said. "Dignity cannot be imported, and freedom cannot be donated. We must either safeguard it ourselves, or we will lose it entirely." The broadcast concluded, leaving many viewers in tears. Burkina Faso had chosen a more arduous path, but it was a path of its own making, and the world was still intently watching. By the sixth day, the pressure had escalated into overt retaliation. International financial institutions quietly blocked transactions associated with Burkina Faso. Certain shipments of aid were mysteriously delayed. Rumors of imminent sanctions circulated within the palace. Panic began to set in among the ministers. Some pleaded with Traoré to reconsider, to resume talks with Gates's foundation, if only to alleviate the growing tension. But Traoré sat in silence before responding calmly. "If freedom can be bartered for food, then it is merely slavery presented as assistance. Let them withhold it. We will eat from our own soil and drink from our own rivers. Though it may taste bitter, our dignity is sweeter." Simultaneously, thousands marched through the streets of Ouagadougou. Farmers brought baskets of millet and corn to the palace gates, chanting, "We will feed our own." Mothers carried water in clay vessels, a symbol of their resilience. On international news, commentators scoffed, labeling it as obstinacy. But across the African continent, people saw something else entirely: courage. Bill Gates, observing from afar, said nothing. His advisors pressed him to make a statement, but he was aware that a single misspoken word would only deepen the humiliation. That night, Traoré assembled his inner circle. Maps, reports, and intelligence briefings covered the table. Advisors warned of foreign agents attempting to incite domestic unrest. Moussa, ever vigilant, stood by the door, listening carefully. He could sense the gravity in the room. "Excellency," one minister ventured, "they will not let this go. They will attempt to destabilize your government, perhaps worse." Traoré leaned forward, his voice unwavering. "Then let them try. They believe Africa is dormant, but we are now awake, and a single spark can ignite 1,000 fires." Meanwhile, beyond the palace walls, ordinary citizens lit candles in their homes. Entire neighborhoods sang hymns of resistance. Children began to repeat the phrase they had learned from their leader: "Africa is not for sale." The world watched, transfixed. Some anticipated Traoré would buckle under the strain. Others feared a more sinister outcome, an attempt to silence him for good. But Traoré had already committed to his course. He was prepared to weather the storm, regardless of its ferocity. On the seventh day, the capital city awoke to a remarkable scene. Tens of thousands of citizens had converged on the central square, waving flags, singing anthems, and shouting, "Traoré is our voice. We stand for dignity." The sheer size of the crowd sent tremors through the city with its chants. Farmers, teachers, soldiers, and children stood united. Traoré emerged on the palace balcony. He raised his hand, and a hush fell over the assembly. His words boomed with authority. They expected Burkina Faso to kneel. But today, I see a nation standing taller than it ever has before. They believed their money could purchase us, but our souls are not for sale. He gestured toward the crowd, his voice thick with emotion. Look at yourselves. This is the true wealth of our nation. Not their contracts, not their promises. You are our treasure, and I will defend you with my life. The square erupted with a mixture of tears and cheers. Mothers hoisted their children into the air, soldiers rendered sharp salutes, and even elderly men wept without restraint. In that instant, it was not merely Traoré who had roared. It was the entirety of Burkina Faso. The roar of the Burkinabe people reverberated well beyond their nation's borders. Videos of Traoré's address saturated social media. In Nigeria, Ghana, and Senegal, students organized marches holding signs that read, "Africa is awake." In Europe, parliamentary debates ignited over whether foreign NGOs had overstepped their bounds for Gates. The humiliation intensified. Major news outlets replayed the clip of his strained expression as Traoré dismantled the agreement. Commentators characterized it as the precise moment that power had shifted. Memes propagated faster than his foundation's official statements. Inside the palace, Traoré reassembled his ministers. The threat of sanctions was imminent, but the voice was imbued with a calm strength. Let them impose their punishments. Every penalty will serve as evidence to the world that their intentions were never benevolent, and every sacrifice we make will become a testament to our strength. Musa, his guard, felt his chest swell with pride. He understood that this transcended politics. This was history being inscribed not by wealth, but by valor. That night, families throughout Burkina Faso lit candles and prayed. Mothers whispered to their children, "Remember this week. One day, you will recount it to your own children." The nation's spirit had been irrevocably transformed. On the final day of that historic week, Traoré returned to the very hall where the deceptive deal was first proposed. This time, the ambience was completely transformed. There were no foreign delegates, no slick presentations, soldiers, and the nation's elders. He stood before them in simple attire, his words imbued with the weight of his people's struggle. "We have been told that we are feeble, that we cannot endure without the guidance of foreigners. But this week, you have demonstrated to me that our strength is far greater than their gold. You are the very heartbeat of this land, and for as long as I draw breath, no one will ever sell you." The crowd erupted, though many wept freely. Old men raised their trembling fists in solidarity. Women held their babies aloft, as if to bless them with dignity. Even battle-hardened soldiers were seen wiping away tears. Traoré's voice softened as he concluded, "A lion does not seek permission to roar, and Burkina Faso is a lion." At that moment, the young leader was not just addressing his nation. He was speaking to the entire planet, and the planet was listening. By the week's conclusion, the verdict was final. The Target Malaria Project was dismantled, its samples were destroyed, and Burkina Faso had made its stand. The true triumph, however, was not in what had been demolished, but in what had been created. Across Africa, conversations shifted. Leaders faced new scrutiny. Young people were galvanized, and the concept of sovereignty evolved from a distant dream into a tangible possibility. Musa, observing from the palace gates, felt tears stream down his face. He thought of his own children and whispered, "You will be raised in a land that refused to bow." As for Gates, the confrontation left an indelible mark. No speech, no donation, and no official statement could ever erase the image of a billionaire, being outwitted by a soldier armed with nothing more than courage and the truth. The story of that week would resonate for generations, a tale of how a young African leader confronted the immense power of the world and chose dignity over submission.